In the immediate aftermath of the crossing of the Red Sea, the newly liberated population entered a psychological and environmental reality that diverged sharply from the euphoria of their deliverance. The moment of liberation itself constituted an intense emotional apex, what can be described in psychological terms as a release effect, in which prolonged oppression is suddenly lifted, producing a surge of collective relief, exhilaration, and renewed identity. This was not merely a political or physical escape, it was experienced as a metaphysical victory, one that appeared to validate a shared belief in divine intervention and destiny. The destruction of their pursuers reinforced a sense of invincibility, embedding within the group a powerful narrative that they had been chosen, protected, and guided by a force beyond human capacity. Such a moment naturally generated a heightened collective confidence, even an expectation that the trajectory ahead would continue to reflect the same pattern of miraculous provision and decisive triumph. However, this emotional peak proved to be remarkably fragile when confronted with the immediate conditions of the Sinai wilderness. The transition from the shores of the sea to the arid expanses of the desert was not gradual but abrupt, producing a rapid psychological deflation. The environment offered no visible continuity with the triumph that preceded it. Instead, it presented an ecosystem defined by scarcity. There was no reliable access to water, no established food supply, and no clear geographical markers to guide movement. The very concept of freedom, which had moments earlier been associated with deliverance and possibility, was recontextualized as exposure and vulnerability. In this sense, freedom revealed its paradoxical dimension. It did not guarantee stability, but rather removed the structures, however oppressive, that had previously provided predictability. What emerged was a state of existential precarity in which survival itself became uncertain. The central insight here is critical. Liberation, in its rawest form, often inaugurates a phase of disorientation and instability more profound than the condition it replaces. This instability was intensified by the specific characteristics of the Sinai landscape, which functioned not merely as a physical setting, but as a psychological stressor. The terrain is marked by vast expanses of uniformity, rock, sand, and sky, blending into a horizon that offers little differentiation. In cognitive terms, such an environment lacks anchors, the reference points that human perception relies upon to construct spatial orientation and meaning. Without these anchors, individuals experience disorientation, a breakdown in their ability to situate themselves within a coherent framework of movement and direction. Compounding this effect are the extreme temperature fluctuations, intense heat during the day, followed by significant surmai at night. These conditions impose continuous physiological strain, which in turn amplifies psychological stress. The result is not merely discomfort, but a deeper form of existential anxiety. In the absence of familiar structures, urban environments, agricultural rhythms, or established social hierarchies, the population faced a crisis of identity. Having defined themselves for generations within the framework of servitude, they now lacked a clear model for autonomous existence. This post-slavery identity crisis involved more than practical uncertainty. It entailed a destabilization of meaning itself. Who were they, if not subjects of an empire? How were they to interpret their suffering in the present, given the promise implied by their deliverance? The Sinai wilderness thus became a crucible in which not only bodies but also belief systems were tested. It is therefore accurate to describe this phase not simply as a physical trial, but as a process of cognitive and spiritual reconfiguration, a restructuring of consciousness under conditions of extreme ambiguity. Within this context, the necessity of supernatural intervention becomes more intelligible, not as a purely theological claim, but as a functional response to systemic limitations. From a logistical perspective, the population lacked the knowledge and infrastructure required for large-scale desert survival. They had no established supply chains, no expertise in resource mapping across arid terrain, and no capacity to generate consistent shelter or nourishment independently. In such conditions, reliance on conventional human leadership alone would have been insufficient. Even a figure such as Moses, while central as a mediator and organizer, could not compensate for the absence of environmental mastery on this scale. The introduction of a guiding, sustaining force beyond human capability thus served multiple critical functions. First, it provided navigation, an externalized system of direction that replaced the unreliable internal judgments of a disoriented population. Second, it mediated the environment, whether through protection from extreme heat, provision of light, or other forms of stabilization that mitigated the harshness of the desert climate. Third, it ensured the provisioning of basic needs, addressing the most immediate threats to survival, and thereby preventing the collapse of social cohesion. Importantly, this intervention also operated at the psychological level. It restored a sense of order within chaos, offering visible and experiential confirmation that the group was not abandoned in their transition. This leads to a crucial reinterpretation of dependence. In many modern frameworks, dependence is often equated with weakness or a failure of autonomy. However, within this context, dependence functioned as a transitional mechanism, a necessary phase in the development of a new, sustainable system of existence. The population was not yet equipped to operate independently in their new environment. The structures required for such independence had yet to be formed. Reliance on a higher guiding system therefore enabled continuity, preventing regression into panic or fragmentation. Over time, this dependence could evolve into a more mature form of trust and discipline, forming the bit foundation upon which a reconstituted identity and ijtimai order could emerge. In summary, the aftermath of the Red Sea crossing reveals a pattern that is both historically specific and universally applicable. Moments of dramatic liberation are often followed by periods of jibhir instability, in which the absence of former constraints exposes underlying vulnerabilities. The Sinai wilderness, far from being a mere geographical passage, functioned as a multidimensional ispitania, physical, psychological, and existential. Within this ispitania, the interplay between human limitation and external guidance became the decisive factor in survival and transformation. Building directly upon the instability and dependence established in the aftermath of the Red Sea crossing, the emergence of the guiding pillar introduces not merely a symbolic reassurance, but a highly structured multifunctional system that operates simultaneously on physical, environmental, and psychological levels. In a landscape defined by unpredictability and deprivation, the pillar, manifesting as cloud by day and fire by night, functions as a continuous interface between the Mayan community and an otherwise hostile environment. Its significance lies precisely in this duality. It is at once observable and transcendent, material in effect yet symbolic in meaning, and therefore uniquely capable of addressing both the external and internal dimensions of Elasma faced by the Jengosthii. During daylight hours, the pillar takes the form of a dense, cohesive cloud, visibly distinct from ordinary atmospheric formations due to its apparent intentionality and directional movement. Unlike passive cloud cover, which drifts according to prevailing winds, this formation exhibits a form of guided motion, maintaining a consistent position relative to the Mardkants below. Its kathafa is critical. It is sufficiently substantial to obscure direct solar radiation, thereby casting an extended kshetra of shade over the traveling population. In the context of the Sinai Desert, where solar exposure can rapidly lead to dehydration, heat exhaustion, and cognitive impairment, this shading effect is not incidental but essential. The cloud acts as a Mozravi canopy, attenuating the intensity of incoming radiation and stabilizing the immediate thermal environment. With the transition to night, this same guiding presence undergoes a transformation into a pillar of fire, and muster of luminous intensity that stands in stark contrast to the surrounding darkness. Unlike transient flames, which flicker and diminish, this fire is characterized by its steadiness and visibility over considerable distances. It functions as a fixed point within an otherwise disorienting nocturnal civique, where the absence of ambient light would typically obscure terrain and amplify cuttery. The ado emitted by the pillar does more than illuminate. It defines a mihwa of orientation, allowing individuals to situate themselves spatially and collectively. In this way, the alternation between cloud and fire is not merely aesthetic or symbolic. It represents a abhyojit system calibrated to the metafaut demands of diurnal and nocturnal survival. This dual manifestation gives rise to a layered meaning structure. On one level, the pillar provides tangible protection. It shields from heat, offers light, and guides movement. On another level, it serves as a visible moisture of continued presence, and sanket that the same force responsible for liberation remains actively engaged in the present. The importance of this cannot be overstated. In pristhiti, where uncertainty threatens to erode collective vishwas, the ability to perceive guidance in real time becomes a stabilizing armor. The pillar thus operates as both infrastructure and sign, merging functional darura with symbolic assurance. From an environmental systems perspective, the pillar can be understood as a node of mobile microclimate regulator. During the day, its shading effect reduces the thermal load imposed on the human body, thereby decreasing rates of perspiration and conserving water, arguably the most critical resource in desert conditions. By moderating direct exposure, it effectively extends the endurance capacity of the population, allowing for sustained movement without immediate physiological breakdown. This is not a trivial adjustment. Even minor reductions in ambient temperature can produce disproportionately large effects on hydration and energy retention. The cloud, therefore, is not merely protective in a passive sense. It actively reshapes the local climate envelope within which the population operates. At night, the function shifts, but remains equally vital. Desert environments are characterized by rapid heat loss, LAHR sunset, leading to temperatures that can become dangerously low, particularly for individuals without adequate shelter or insulation. The pillar of fire introduces a localized heat source, mitigating the surmai and reducing the risk of hypothermia. Simultaneously, its illumination extends the field of Bezapasner perception, allowing hazards, whether geographical or haywani, to be detected and avoided. Darkness, which would otherwise amplify vulnerability, is transformed into a navigable and controlled domain. In aggregate, these functions justify the characterization of the pillar as a dynamic environmental nidham, one that travels with the population and continuously adapts to temporal shifts. Yet, the full significance of the pillar becomes most apparent when considering its psychological impact. In conditions of prolonged uncertainty, the human mind seeks patterns, sthirta, and signals of predictability. The absence of such signals often leads to heightened anxiety, sunday, and fragmentation of group cohesion. The pillar directly counters this tendency by providing a constant visual reference point. Whether in the form of cloud or fire, it is always present, always visible, and always aligned with the movement, or twokf, of the group. This constancy transforms perception itself. What was previously experienced as chaotic and indifferent terrain becomes, through the lens of the pillar, a structured messiah with discernible direction. Light, in particular, plays a nirnayak role in this transformation. The presence of sustained illumination during a lail reduces primal fears associated with darkness, fears that are deeply embedded in human cognition due to evolutionary pressures. When individuals can see their surroundings, even partially, the unknown becomes less threatening. This perceptual clarity translates into emotional stability. Panic gives way to composure. Isolation gives way to a sense of shared orientation. The community, gathered around a common muster of light, experiences not only physical proximity, but also psychological cohesion. The pillar, in this sense, becomes a kendra of Ijtima, a focal point around which both movement and meaning are organized. The internal effects of this visual stability are cumulative. Over time, repeated exposure to a reliable external guide fosters trust, not only in the guide itself, but in the process of following. Individuals begin to recalibrate their pratikriya to uncertainty, shifting from reactive pay to anticipatory confidence. The transition is subtle but profound. Instead of interpreting each NTUN paristiti as a potential threat, the population learns to interpret it within a broader framework of guided yatra. This is the emergence of what might be termed mediated trust, where confidence is not derived from personal control over circumstances, but from consistent alignment with an external nirdeshnaya. Ultimately, the pillar demonstrates a critical principle, that visual stability can generate psychological stability, particularly in environments where traditional structures of certainty have collapsed. By anchoring perception, it anchors emotion. By organizing space, it organizes thought. In doing so, it enables a jengosti in transition, not merely to survive, but to begin the process of internal reordering. The desert remains harsh, unpredictable, and inherently dangerous, but it is no longer experienced as incomprehensible. Through the continuous presence of the pillar, the wilderness is reframed, from an sivaki of bhai into a messiah of guided transformation. Extending from the environmental and psychological stabilization introduced by the pillar of cloud and fire, a more demanding layer of formation begins to emerge, one that does not merely sustain life, but actively reshapes behavior, cognition, and time perception. This is the discipline of what may be termed sacred timing, a system in which movement, tuakuf, and progression are no longer determined by human preference or strategic planning, but by an external, non-negotiable signal. If the pillar in its physical manifestation addressed the bahran of survival and orientation, its temporal function addresses something more complex, the reconfiguration of human agency itself. At the core of this system lies a mechanism that is deceptively simple, yet profoundly disruptive. When the cloud lifts and begins to move, the entire community must mobilize. When it settles, they must stop. There is no intermediate negotiation, no partial compliance, and no predictive schedule that can be extrapolated from prior patterns. Movement is contingent, not planned. Tuakuf is imposed, not chosen. This creates a dynamic in which time is no longer experienced as a linear resource to be managed, but as a sequence of responses to an external directive. In effect, the population transitions from a model of autonomous scheduling to one of reactive synchronization. The consequences of this shift are significant. In most human systems, whether agricultural, industrial, or even nomadic, rhythms are established through repetition and expectation. Days are structured, seasons anticipated, and actions sequenced according to a degree of foresight. Here, that framework is deliberately dismantled. The Adam of a fixed timetable introduces a persistent halat of uncertainty. Individuals cannot plan journeys in advance, cannot optimize rest cycles according to personal preference, and cannot predict when effort will be required. This unpredictability undermines the deeply ingrained cognitive bias toward control, the assumption that stability arises from the ability to forecast and manage future conditions. Such a disruption is not merely inconvenient, it is psychologically taxing. The inability to anticipate movement generates a continuous low-level tanav, as the mind remains alert to the possibility of sudden change. Over time, this evolves into a more acute form of fatigue, not solely physical, but decisional and emotional. The prolonged intivar, periods during which the cloud remains stationary without explanation, can be particularly destabilizing. In these intervals, the absence of visible progress may be interpreted as stagnation or even abandonment. The community, having been conditioned to equate movement with purpose, is forced to confront the possibility that Tokv itself may carry meaning. This is where the dual process of frustration and maturation begins to unfold. On one level, the experience of waiting produces tangible dissatisfaction. The lack of autonomy, of the ability to decide when to move, where to go, and how long to remain, can be perceived as a regression into passivity. For a population recently oswobojeni from enforced labor and external ascitra, this imposed dependence may feel paradoxical, even contradictory. The expectation of freedom as self-determination clashes with the reality of obedience to an unseen timing mechanism. Yet, embedded within this frustration is the potential for a different kind of development. The repeated experience of delayed movement, of being required to wait without clear justification, begins to recalibrate the relationship between intention and outcome. Patience, in this context, is not a passive endurance, but an active disciplina, the ability to remain aligned with a process that does not immediately validate one's ojidania. Over time, this discipline fosters a deeper temporal awareness, one that extends beyond immediate gratification toward a longer horizon of trust. This is why delay must be understood not as inefficiency, but as a deliberate instrument of psychological formation. By withholding immediate progression, the system compels individuals to confront their own pratikritya to Adam control. Do they interpret waiting as loss or as preparation? Do they resist stillness or learn to inhabit it? These questions are not abstract. They shape the internal architecture of belief and resilience. In this sense, Tokv becomes as formative as the time of movement. Each pause functions as a priksin, a test not of endurance alone, but of interpretive capacity. As this process continues, a third dimension emerges, the cultivation of continuous readiness. Because movement can be initiated at any moment, the community must exist in a state of postoyanная готовность. Camps cannot be structured for permanence. Possessions must remain organized for rapid intikal. Attention must be attuned to the slightest sanket of change. This requirement transforms the very mafhum of stability. Stability is no longer associated with fixed absthan, but with the ability to transition smoothly between states. The ta'thir of this shift on cognition is profound. Individuals begin to develop what modern psychology would term an adaptive mindset, a mode of thinking characterized by flexibility, speed in reorientation, and tolerance for ambiguity. Instead of anchoring identity in static conditions, they learn to anchor it in responsiveness. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduces its destabilizing effect. When change is expected, even if its timing is unknown, it becomes less threatening. The unknown is integrated into the operating model rather than treated as an anomaly. Moreover, this readiness extends beyond logistics into perception itself. The community becomes increasingly sensitive to patterns of sanket, subtle changes in the position or density of the cloud, shifts in a dough intensity, or variations in environmental cues. Attention, therefore, is sharpened. What was once diffuse and reactive becomes focused and anticipatory. This heightened awareness reinforces collective cohesion, as individuals must coordinate their responses within a shared framework of observation and action. Taken together, these dynamics illustrate a fundamental transformation, the movement from what can be described as static stability to dynamic stability. In a static model, stability is achieved through fixed structures, permanent dwellings, predictable schedules, and controlled environments. In a dynamic model, stability emerges from the al-qudra to adapt continuously within fluctuating conditions. The former prioritizes control, the latter prioritizes alignment. The discipline of sacred timing systematically dismantles the first in order to cultivate the second. This transformation does not occur without cost. It requires the tammel of uncertainty, the surrender of immediate autonomy, and the tammel of repeated frustration. Yet, it also produces a form of resilience that cannot be generated under conditions of carnal predictability. By the time this al-marhalat of formation matures, the population is no longer merely surviving the wilderness. It is being reconfigured by it. Time itself, once a neutral backdrop, has become an active agent in this reconfiguration, shaping not only when people move, but how they understand movement, waiting, and purpose. In continuity with the stabilizing presence of the pillar, the discipline of sacred timing completes a crucial phase of transformation. Where the pillar anchored space, sacred timing restructures time. Together, they create a comprehensive framework in which both environment and temporality are mediated, allowing al-mujtama in transition to develop the internal capacities required for a future that remains, at this stage, still unseen. Building upon the spatial stabilization of the pillar and the temporal reconfiguration imposed by sacred timing, the journey now advances into its most demanding phase, the traversal of an environment that is not merely difficult, but fundamentally beyond the intuitive navigational capacity of human cognition. The Sinai wilderness, already established as a psychological and environmental crucible, reveals itself in this al-marhala as a domain of compounded khatar, where geography, climate, and uncertainty converge to produce a condition of sustained vulnerability. At the most immediate level, the dangers are material and relentless. Secular scarcity defines the baseline constraint. Without consistent access to MIM, the insani body rapidly deteriorates, and with it, cognitive clarity and group cohesion. Unlike settled manatik where water sources can be mapped and revisited, the desert offers no such reliability. Springs are rare, often hidden, and not reproducible through simple observation. This absence of predictable resource forces the population into a state of continuous dependency on external provision. Compounding this is the terrain itself: jagged rock formations, unstable sand, and uneven ground that resist efficient movement. The act of travel becomes labor-intensive, increasing caloric expenditure while simultaneously limiting opportunities for recovery. Overlaying these stir hazards are dynamic threats: sandstorms capable of erasing visibility within moments, and temperature extremes that oscillate between debilitating heat and opassing cold. These conditions do not merely challenge endurance, they disrupt orientation. Landmarks, if they exist at all, are transient, obscured by shifting a ramal or rendered indistinguishable by a dough distortion. Most critically, there is an absence of reliable cartographic knowledge. No established maps exist that can guide a population of this scale across such terrain. In aggregate, these factors produce an environment that exceeds what can be termed natural navigation, the human capacity to orient based on memory, a Shams position, or recognizable features. The wilderness, in this sense, is not simply unknown. It is systematically resistant to being known through conventional means. It is precisely within this context that the function of the pillar of fire, particularly during nocturnal movement, acquires its full significance. Beyond its role as illumination, it operates as a lighthouse, a stir reference point that organizes space around itself. In maritime contexts, a lighthouse transforms an opassing coastline into a navigable approach by providing a consistent visual signal. Similarly, in the desert, the pillar converts an otherwise formless expanse into a structured path. Its verticality is crucial. Rising above the horizon, it remains visible even when al-ard level visibility is compromised. This allows the population to maintain directional coherence without relying on al-ard-based markers that may shift or disappear. More importantly, the pillar functions as a cognitive convergence point. In a mahit where individual perception is fragmented and unreliable, a shared visual anchor synchronizes interpretation. Each baikati, regardless of their immediate surroundings, can orient themselves toward the same signal. This eliminates the khatar of divergent misir, of subgroups moving in conflicting directions due to ikhtilaf in perception. The pillar, therefore, is not merely a guide, it is a unifying mihwar that aligns collective movement within a single trajectory. The psychological transformation produced by this system is profound. What was previously experienced as a threatening, indeterminate space begins to be reinterpreted as a marg, and masir with direction and maqsad, even if that maqsad remains unseen. Fear, which thrives in ambiguity, is gradually replaced by a structured expectation. That movement, when aligned with the guiding signal, will lead somewhere coherent. This does not eliminate danger, but it reframes it within a context of guidance. The desert remains hazardous, but it is no longer meaningless. This shift in perception parallels a deeper parivartan in the structure of leadership and trust. Initially, the population's orientation is mediated through a human figure, most notably Moses, who serves as the interpreter of divine will and the organizer of al-Jamara. In this phase, authority is personalized, guidance flows through a recognizable, embodied leader. However, as the pillar's role becomes increasingly central and directly observable, a tadriji intikal occurs. Trust begins to relocate from the human intermediary to the system of guidance itself. The community no longer relies solely on verbal instruction or mediated nirne. They respond to a visible mushtrak signal that requires no translation. This transition has significant implications. It represents a redistribution of epistemic authority from a single leader to a shared perceptual experience. Each individual can see the cloud or the fire, each can verify its movement. This does not eliminate the role of leadership, but it reframes it within a larger framework in which ultimate direction is externalized. The hierarchy becomes less about control and more about coordination. In effect, the system of belief is being restructured, from reliance on human al-qiyada to i'timad on a transcendent yet directly accessible guide. Such a restructuring is essential for al-Jamara's long-term formation. A purely leader-centric model is vulnerable to failure if the leader is absent or misinterpreted. By contrast, a system anchored in a consistent external signal distributes responsibility and awareness across the population. Trust becomes both collective and experiential, rather than purely delegated. This marks a Nirnayak evolution in the architecture of faith and governance. When this entire framework is translated into the context of the modern, digitally saturated world of 2026, its relevance becomes strikingly clear. The ancient desert and the contemporary informazioni landscape, while superficially different, share a structural similarity. Both are environments in which traditional orientieri have collapsed. In the Sinai, the challenge was a lack of information. No maps, no sphere landmarks, no pure established routes. In the modern world, the problem is inverted but analogous, an overabundance of information, much of it conflicting, unreliable, or strategically manipulated. The result, however, is the same: disorientation. In 2026, individuals are confronted not with empty horizons, but with saturated feeds, continuous streams of data that exceed the capacity for meaningful integration. Decision-making becomes paralyzed by excess. Clarity dissolves into noise. This produces a form of collective anxiety that mirrors, at a cognitive level, the existential unease of the desert. People struggle to determine what is true, what is relevant, and what direction to follow. The crisis is not physical survival, but epistemic stability. Within this context, the concept of a pillar acquires renewed significance, not as a literal phenomenon, but as a structural necessity. Modern individuals must identify their own guiding anchors, systems or principles that function analogously to the cloud and fire. The first step in this process is simplification, reducing the number of inputs to a manageable set of trusted sources. Without such filtering, perception becomes fragmented and nirne loses coherence. Closely related is the identification of core values. stable criteria against which information can be evaluated. These values function as an internal compass, enabling consistent judgment even when external proof are volatile. Practical strategies emerge from this framework. The establishment of daily rituals introduces rhythmic stability into otherwise chaotic schedules, mirroring the Tawakuf phases of the wilderness journey. Information filtering, whether through mahdud exposure to al-akhbar or deliberate curation of sources, reduces cognitive overload. The development of a personal decision framework ensures that actions are guided by predefined principles rather than lahfa impulses. Together, these practices form a modern equivalent of the pillar, a system that does not eliminate uncertainty but renders it navigable. Equally important is the recognition that guidance in such environments often comes through layered structures, mentors, intellectuality traditions, and ethical frameworks that provide clarity amid noise. These are not substitutes for autonomy, but extensions of it, tools that enhance the ability to orient without being overwhelmed. Just as the ancient community learned to align itself with a visible signal, modern individuals must learn to align with coherent systems of meaning that cut through informational entropy. This leads to the final and perhaps most counterintuitive insight of the entire journey, the revaluation of maqsad itself. In contemporary culture, there is a pervasive fixation on outcomes, on arrival, achievement, and Kanichni results. Success is measured by endpoints, and processes are often reduced to means. The Sinai experience challenges this orientation at a fundamental level. Movement in the wilderness is not linear progression toward a clearly defined destination. It is a sequence of adjustments, pauses, and MHDSH alignments. Each Tawakuf, each redirection, carries its own formative significance. To live within such a framework is to shift from an outcome-obsessed model to a process-oriented one. The value of the journey lies not solely in where it leads, but in how it transforms those who undertake it. Adaptation, patience, and trust are not byproducts. They are the primary outputs. The destination, while important, is not the sole measure of meaning. In conclusion, the trajectory that begins at the Red Sea and extends through the wilderness reveals a coherent pattern of transformation. What starts as liberation evolves into disorientation, which then necessitates guidance, discipline, and ultimately reinterpretation. The pillar stabilizes space, sacred timing restructures time, the wilderness redefines perception, and the journey itself reshapes identity. In both ancient and modern contexts, the underlying principle remains consistent. True growth does not occur at the point of arrival, but within the continuous process of movement under reliable guidance. If this exploration of the wilderness journey, its psychological tension, adaptive discipline, and deeper meaning resonated with you, consider supporting the channel so we can continue developing analyses like this. Like the video to help surface this perspective to others navigating similar uncertainty, subscribe to stay connected with upcoming deep dive content, and follow the channel for continuous insights into history, philosophy, and modern complexity.